My name is Catherine Ironwood, and I've been a park ranger for 11 years. People always ask me why I chose Alaska, why I picked the most remote section of Denali National Park to call home. The truth is, after what happened in Colorado, I needed the silence. I needed a place where the only sounds were wind through the valleys and my own breathing. Wonder Lake sector is 80 miles from the nearest road. In March, when this story takes place, we get maybe 4 hours of dim light each day. The rest is darkness so complete you can't see your hand in front of your face. Most people think that sounds terrible. To me, it was perfect. I specialized in mountain rescue and wildlife photography. Spent my days checking on remote weather stations, maintaining emergency shelters, and making sure nobody got themselves killed trying to climb McKinley in winter. It was quiet work, safe work, the kind where your biggest worry is a broken snowmobile or a sudden blizzard. That morning in March 1976 started like any other. I was drinking coffee in my cabin when the radio crackled to life. Park headquarters wanted me to check on Dr. James Fletcher, a glaciologist who'd been studying ice cores up in the northern valleys. He'd missed his last 2 check-ins, which wasn't like him. Fletcher was careful, methodical, the kind of scientist who followed protocols because he knew how fast things could go wrong out here. I loaded my snowmobile and headed north. The ride took 3 hours through country so empty it felt like the moon. No tracks, no signs of life. Just endless white under a sky the color of old pewter. The silence was so deep it had weight. Fletcher's camp was supposed to be in a sheltered valley below Mount Brooks. I found it all right, or what was left of it. His research tent was shredded, not torn by wind but ripped apart like someone had grabbed it with giant hands and twisted. Scientific equipment worth thousands of dollars was scattered across half a mile of snow. I found his weather instruments smashed against rocks, his ice core samples melted and refrozen into useless chunks. But it was the footprints that made my blood turn cold. They were human-shaped, but 18 inches long and pressed deep into snow that had frozen solid. Whatever made them weighed far more than any person. The prints led from the destroyed camp toward a line of dark mountains in the distance. They were spaced 10 feet apart, like whatever was walking had legs twice as long as mine. I'd seen bear tracks, moose tracks, tracks from every animal that lived in Alaska. These weren't made by any animal I knew. I radioed headquarters immediately. Base, this is Ironwood. We have a situation at Fletcher's location. Requesting immediate helicopter evacuation for missing person. Camp has been destroyed. Copy that, Catherine. What kind of destruction? Storm damage? I stared at those impossible footprints. Negative. This wasn't weather. Requesting backup and SAR team. There was a long pause. Then, choppers grounded until tomorrow morning. Weather front moving in. You'll need to establish overnight shelter and continue search on foot. That's when the wrongness really hit me. In 11 years of ranger work, I'd never seen anything like Fletcher's camp. It looked like a tornado had touched down in one specific spot, but the snow around it was undisturbed. The destruction was too focused, too deliberate. And those tracks. They headed straight north, toward the deepest wilderness in Alaska, toward country where no human being had any business going in winter. I set up my emergency shelter and started following the trail. The tracks were so clear, they looked like they'd been made minutes ago, not days. They led through a narrow valley between 2 peaks, then up toward a series of caves that local Athabascan people had marked on old maps with warnings I'd never bothered to translate. As the sun set and darkness closed in around me, I realized something that made my skin crawl. In all those miles of tracking, Across all that empty wilderness, I hadn't seen a single sign of any other animal. No rabbit tracks, no bird sign, nothing. It was like everything alive had fled the area. Everything except whatever had destroyed Fletcher's camp and left those impossible footprints in the snow. The next morning brought news that chilled me worse than the 40 below temperature. The helicopter pilot radioed in before sunrise. "Catherine, this is Mike in Rescue 1. I'm circling your sector now, but we've got a problem. I can see something moving down there. Something big. Too big to be human." I grabbed my radio. "Can you get a better look?" "Negative. It's staying near the tree line, but Catherine, this thing is watching me. It's standing upright like a person, but it's got to be 15 feet tall. When I tried to get closer, it moved into the rocks. Moved fast." That's when Robert Youngbear's voice came over the radio. Robert was another ranger, Athabascan, and one of the few people who knew these mountains better than I did. "Mike, stay clear of that area. Catherine, I'm coming to you by dog sled. Should be there in 4 hours." "Why dog sled?" I asked. "Your snowmobile would be faster." "Machine spirits don't work right up there anymore," Robert said, using the old way of talking his grandmother had taught him. "Dogs still listen." I'd worked with Robert for 6 years and never heard him talk like that. He was educated, practical, the kind of guy who fixed broken equipment with duct tape and common sense. But something in his voice told me this wasn't the time to argue. I spent the morning following those tracks deeper into the valley. They led to a series of ice caves carved into the mountainside by centuries of wind and water. The tracks went right up to the largest cave and disappeared inside. That's where I found Fletcher's journals. It was lying open in the snow, pages frozen together, but still readable. The last entry was dated 3 days ago. Day 12. Something has been watching the camp. I first noticed it yesterday evening, a dark shape against the rocks, too large to be a bear standing upright. Today it came closer. I could see it clearly through binoculars, human-shaped but massive, covered in white fur or hair, intelligent eyes. It's not afraid of me. If anything, it seems curious, like it's studying me. The next page made my hands shake. Day 13. It's been circling the camp all night. I can hear it walking outside the tent, footsteps so heavy they make the ground shake. This morning I found my food cache torn open. Not eaten, just destroyed. It's playing with me, testing me. I think it knows I can't leave. The weather's too bad for extraction. I've armed myself with the flare gun, but what good will that do against something this size? If anyone finds this journal, tell my wife I love her. Tell her I tried to come home. The final entry was just one line, written in shaky handwriting. It's coming for me. I was so focused on reading that I almost missed the sound. A low rumble, like distant thunder, but it came from below ground, from the cave. Then I heard something that made every instinct I had scream danger. Fletcher's voice, calling for help from somewhere deep in the darkness. "Help me, please, I'm hurt. I can't move." The voice echoed out of the cave, weak and desperate, but something about it was wrong. The words were too clear, too perfectly spaced, like someone was reading from a script. I pulled out my flashlight and approached the cave entrance. The beam barely penetrated the darkness inside. "Fletcher, is that you?" "Catherine?" "Oh, thank God. I'm trapped in here. My leg is broken. Please come help me." That's when I realized what was wrong. I'd never told him my name. There was no way Fletcher could know who I was. The voice came again, still pleading, still perfectly articulated despite claiming to have a broken leg and being trapped for 3 days. "Please, Catherine, I'm so cold. I'm dying. You have to help me." I backed away from the cave entrance. As I did, I heard something else. Movement in the darkness. Something large shifting position. And underneath Fletcher's voice, so quiet I almost missed it, was another sound. Breathing. Deep, slow breathing that didn't match the rhythm of the voice calling for help. That's when Robert arrived with his dog team. 8 huskies pulling a sled, moving faster across the snow than any machine could have managed. The dogs were nervous, whining and pulling against their traces as they got close to the cave. Robert took one look at the scene. The destroyed journal, the massive footprints, my pale face, and started unpacking something I'd never seen before. It looked like old weapons wrapped in traditional beadwork. "That's not Fletcher," he said simply. "That's the Nakani. It learns voices from people it catches, uses them to hunt." "The what?" "Giant, ancient thing that lives in the deep caves. Grandmother always said they wake up when the world gets sick, when the balance is wrong." The voice from the cave had stopped calling, but I could still hear that slow, patient breathing, like whatever was in there was listening to our conversation, learning our voices too. Robert's dogs suddenly erupted into terrified howling and broke formation, trying to flee south. It took all his skill to keep them controlled. In the silence that followed, we heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps, coming from inside the cave. Each step shook the ground beneath our feet. "We need to leave," Robert said. "Now." But as we turned to go, I saw something that stopped me cold. Fresh tracks in the snow behind us. The same 18-inch prints I'd been following, but these led from a completely different direction. We were being stalked, had been for hours, and we were still 3 days away from any help. We ran. For the first time in my 11 years as a ranger, I abandoned my post and ran like hell. Robert's dogs needed no encouragement. They raced across the snow like their tails were on fire, pulling the sled faster than I'd ever seen animals move. Behind us, something roared. It wasn't a bear roar or wolf howl or any sound made by a natural animal. It was rage and hunger and intelligence, all rolled into something that felt like physical pressure against my eardrums. The sound echoed off the mountains and came back to us doubled, tripled, until the whole valley was screaming. My snowmobile started fine, but within a mile the engine began stuttering. The same machine that had run perfectly for 3 years was failing when I needed it most. Robert pulled up beside me as I coasted to a stop. "Electronics don't work right around Nakani," he said. "Old grandmother stories, but they're true. We go on foot from here." We abandoned the machines and started hiking south through deep snow. It should have been exhausting work, but fear kept us moving. Every few hundred yards, we'd see those massive tracks paralleling our route. Whatever was following us was staying just out of sight, but never far away. That's when the weather turned. In Alaska, you learn to read the signs. The way wind shifts, how pressure changes feel in your bones. But this wasn't natural weather. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 10 minutes. The wind picked up from the north, driving snow so hard we could barely see 10 feet ahead. "It's calling the storm," Robert said, shouting over the wind, making it harder for us to travel. "That's impossible." Lots of impossible things in these mountains. My grandmother knew them all. We made it another 2 miles before we had to stop. The blizzard was getting worse, and my emergency shelter was our only hope of surviving until it passed. We set it up in the lee of some rocks, working by feel as the world disappeared in swirling white. Inside the small tent, huddled around a chemical heat source, Robert told me about the Nakani. "They're old," he said. older than Athabascan people, older than the mountains themselves. They sleep most of the time down in the deep caves where the earth is warm. But when the world gets out of balance, when things change too fast, they wake up. And you think that's what happened to Fletcher? Robert nodded. Climate's been changing fast up here, ice melting where it should be solid, animals moving to new places. Nakani wakes up and sees his territory invaded by someone with machines and science equipment, so he protects it the only way he knows how. Outside the shelter, we could hear footsteps circling us, slow, deliberate steps that crunched through snow and over rocks. Whatever was out there was taking its time, studying our position, planning. Then the voice started again. But this time it wasn't Fletcher. "Catherine?" It was my own voice calling from outside the tent. "Robert, where are you? I'm lost out here. I need help." I felt my skin crawl. The voice was perfect. My accent, my speech patterns, even the slight rasp I got when I was cold. But I was sitting right here, listening to myself call for help from the storm. "It's learning," Robert whispered, "getting better at copying us." The voice changed. Now it was Robert calling, "Catherine, I found Fletcher. He's alive. Come out here and help me with him." But Robert was sitting right next to me, his face grim in the chemical light. Then we heard a third voice. A woman's voice I didn't recognize speaking in Athabascan. Robert's face went white. "That's my grandmother," he whispered. "She died 5 years ago." The voice spoke again, and though I couldn't understand the words, the tone was urgent, commanding. Robert started to move toward the tent entrance. "No," I grabbed his arm. "Don't listen to it. She's telling me to come outside. She says she knows how to stop this thing." "It's not your grandmother. It's the creature." But Robert was already unzipping the tent flap. The blizzard had stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving the night crystal clear and bitterly cold. Stars blazed overhead like ice chips. Standing 50 feet away was a woman who looked exactly like the photos I'd seen of Robert's grandmother. Small, elderly, wearing traditional clothing. She gestured for us to follow her toward the tree line. "I know it's not really her," Robert said. "But Catherine, what if it is? What if she came back to help us?" That's when I saw the footprints around the woman. 18-inch tracks that led right up to where she stood. The creature was using her image like a mask, trying to lure us out of shelter. But as we watched, the image began to flicker. For just a moment, I saw what was really standing there, something massive and white, covered in coarse fur, arms that hung down to its knees, eyes that reflected our flashlight beams like a cat's, but filled with an intelligence that was completely human. And it was smiling. The image of Robert's grandmother disappeared, leaving only empty snow and those terrible tracks. But from the darkness beyond our light came a sound that made me understand how small and helpless we really were. Laughter. Low and rumbling, but definitely laughter. The creature thought this was funny. We were trapped miles from help, being hunted by something that could control weather and perfectly mimic human voices. Something that saw our fear and found it entertaining. That's when I heard the dogs barking in the distance and realized help was coming. But I also realized something else. Whatever was hunting us had been playing with us so far. Now that others were approaching, the game was about to change. The real terror was just beginning. The barking got closer, and soon Mary Nikolai emerged from the tree line with a team of 6 dogs pulling a traditional sled. Mary was an elder from the village, Robert's great-aunt, and the closest thing to a traditional medicine woman our area had left. She was also the toughest person I'd ever met. The kind of woman who could survive a week in the wilderness with nothing but a knife and her knowledge of the land. But even Mary looked scared. "We have to go to the sacred cave," she said without any greeting. "It's the only place the Nakani can't follow. Old agreements, old laws." "What sacred cave?" I asked. Robert pointed north, back toward where we'd come from. "There's a special place, maybe 2 miles from here. But Mary, that's closer to where the thing is hunting." "No choice," she said. "More Nakani coming. This one called his brothers with that big roar. I counted at least 3 sets of tracks on my way here. 3 of them." My blood turned to ice water. We loaded what we could carry and started north. Mary led the way with her dogs, following paths I couldn't even see in the snow. She moved like she'd been born to this landscape, reading signs in the ice and wind that told her exactly where to go. But we weren't alone. The tracks paralleled our route again, but now there were multiple sets. The creatures were coordinating, staying just out of sight but close enough to let us know they were there. After an hour of hiking, Mary stopped beside what looked like an ordinary rock formation. But when I looked closer, I could see carved symbols worked into the stone. Old symbols, worn smooth by centuries of weather. "This is it," she said. "The boundary. They won't cross this line." She started unpacking things from her sled. Traditional items I didn't recognize. Carved bone, bundles of herbs, a ceremonial knife that looked ancient. But she also had modern emergency supplies, including a powerful flare gun and several signal flares. "The fire ceremony," Robert explained. "It's how our people have kept the Nakani in the deep places for hundreds of years. Sacred fire that reminds them of the agreements their ancestors made with ours." "Will it work?" I asked. Mary looked at me with eyes that had seen 8 decades of Alaskan wilderness. "Child, I don't know. The world is changing too fast. Old agreements might not hold." That's when they came. 3 shapes emerged from the tree line, moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for their size. They were everything Robert had described and worse. 15 feet tall, covered in thick white fur that seemed to glow in the starlight. Arms that reached past their knees, ending in hands that could have wrapped around my entire torso. And faces that were almost human but wrong in every detail. Too large, too angular, with eyes that held intelligence and cruelty in equal measure. They stopped at the edge of the carved stones, just beyond the boundary Mary had indicated. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the largest one spoke. It used Fletcher's voice. "Please help me. I'm so cold." Then my voice. "Robert, where are you?" Then Robert's grandmother again, speaking in Athabascan. All 3 voices came from the same creature, overlapping and blending until it sounded like a chorus of trapped souls calling for help. Mary started her ceremony. She built a small fire using traditional methods, adding herbs that filled the air with sweet smoke. She spoke in her own language, words that seemed to carry weight and power. The fire flared higher than it should have, casting shadows that danced across the carved stones. The creatures backed away from the flames, but they didn't leave. Instead, they began to circle our position, staying just outside the boundary, testing the limits of whatever protection the sacred site offered. That's when we found Fletcher. He was lying in a shallow depression behind the rock formation, barely alive but breathing. His legs were broken and he was suffering from severe frostbite, but somehow he'd survived 3 days of exposure. The creatures had kept him alive, probably to use as bait. "They wanted you to find me," Fletcher whispered when we reached him. I heard them talking. They can speak to each other without voices, just by thinking. They were planning to take you all when you came to rescue me. Mary's ceremony reached its climax. The fire roared higher, and something shifted in the air around us. The temperature rose 10 degrees, and the aurora borealis appeared overhead, painting the sky in sheets of green and blue light. The largest creature threw back its head and roared. The sound was deafening, full of rage and frustration. Then all three of them melted back into the forest, moving so silently they might have been ghosts. But I could feel them out there, waiting. The sacred fire had bought us time, but it hadn't solved our problem. Still had to get Fletcher medical attention, and we were still miles from safety. Mary's radio crackled to life. The storm had passed, and helicopter evacuation was finally possible. But the chopper couldn't land in our current location. We'd have to move Fletcher to a clearing 2 miles south. 2 miles through country where 3 ancient predators were waiting for us to leave the protection of the sacred site. "I'll go first," I said. "Draw them away from the group." "No," Mary said firmly. "We go together, or we don't go at all. Old ways are best ways." She was right. We rigged a stretcher for Fletcher, loaded the rest of our gear, and prepared to make the most dangerous journey of our lives. As we stepped beyond the carved stones, I could feel eyes watching us from the darkness. The hunt was back on. The helicopter rescue went smoothly once we reached the landing zone, but only because Mary's dogs detected the creatures before they could set up an ambush. Every time the Nakani tried to get close, the dogs would howl and pull in the opposite direction, giving us just enough warning to avoid the worst of it. Fletcher survived, though he lost 3 toes to frostbite and had to retire from field research. The official report listed it as a bear attack combined with severe weather exposure. The Park Service decided it was easier to blame nature than to try explaining what had really happened. I kept working as a ranger for another 10 years, but I never went into the northern valleys alone again. Every winter, I'd hear stories from other rangers about strange tracks, missing equipment, and voices calling for help where no people should be. The Nakani were still out there, still protecting their territory the only way they knew how. Robert transferred to a different sector after that winter. He said the mountains held too many old memories, too many voices calling from the deep places. He was right. Once you've heard something mimic your own voice perfectly, you never trust echoes again. Mary became my teacher. She spent the next few years showing me which places were safe and which carried ancient warnings. I learned to read the traditional markers, to understand why certain valleys were avoided by native hunters, and to respect knowledge that was older than any science I'd studied in school. The climate kept changing. Ice melted in places it had been solid for centuries, and animal migration patterns shifted in ways that confused biologists. And with each major change, there were more reports of strange encounters in Alaska's wilderness. Not just Nakani, but other things. Old things that had been sleeping in the deep places, waiting for the world to change enough to wake them up. I retired from the Park Service in 1986, but I still guide researchers who need to work in sensitive areas. I teach them the traditional protocols, show them the boundary markers, and make sure they understand that some places require more than just scientific equipment and radio check-ins. The official government position is that these encounters are misidentified wildlife combined with environmental stress and isolation-induced hallucinations. But there are classified protocols now, procedures for dealing with what they call environmental anomaly encounters. Rangers carry different equipment than we used to, and there are places on the maps marked with restrictions that have nothing to do with weather or terrain. Fletcher never talked about what happened to him during those 3 days. The doctors said it was trauma-induced memory loss. but I think he remembered everything and chose not to share it. Some knowledge is too dangerous to pass along to people who aren't ready to handle it. Sometimes on clear winter nights when the aurora borealis lights up the sky, I can hear them calling from the northern valleys. Voices that sound like people I know, pleading for help from the darkness. But I've learned not to answer. The mountains are changing, and things that slept for centuries are waking up. The old agreements between humans and the deep wilderness are being tested by a world that's transforming faster than anyone expected. We can choose to respect those boundaries, or we can keep pushing into places we don't belong and deal with the consequences. My name is Catherine Ironwood, and I've seen what happens when we choose wrong. The choice, as always, is ours. But remember this: when you're alone in the wilderness and you hear a familiar voice calling for help from the darkness, make sure you know where everyone in your group is before you answer, because sometimes the voice you hear is your own. My name is Anthony Blackwater, and I've been a park ranger at Katmai National Park in Alaska for 15 years. Before you think this is just another campfire story, let me tell you something. I'm a geologist by training. I believe in facts, data, and things you can measure with instruments. Or at least, I used to. It was August 1987, peak tourist season, and the height of the salmon run. I was stationed in the Valley of 10,000 Smokes, the most remote part of Katmai. You can only get there by bush plane, and even then, the volcanic activity makes it dangerous. The whole area sits on top of what used to be a massive volcano that blew its top in 1912. Biggest eruption in recorded history for this part of Alaska. Most people don't know about the bears that died that day. The eruption was so sudden, so violent, that hundreds of grizzlies were caught in their dens. Just gone. Buried under ash and lava. The local Yupik people have stories about it. They say the spirits of those bears never found peace. I always thought that was just folklore, something to tell tourists around the fire. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. Dr. Patricia Hammond, a volcanologist from the University of Alaska, had missed her scheduled pickup. Her research permit had her studying the 1912 eruption site, looking for new evidence about volcanic gas composition. Frank Kozlov, our bush pilot, had dropped her off 3 days earlier with supplies for a week. When Frank flew over her campsite that morning, something was wrong. Her bright orange tent was still there, but it looked damaged. From the air, he couldn't tell what had happened. Radio calls got no response. I grabbed my gear and had Frank drop me at the nearest landing strip about 2 miles from her camp. The hike took me through typical Katmai terrain, ash fields, scattered pumice, and the ever-present smell of sulfur from the active fumaroles. The ground here never really settles. It's always shifting, always reminding you that you're walking on top of something that could wake up any moment. But as I got closer to Hammond's campsite, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The usual sounds were gone. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the brush. Even the ever-present buzz of mosquitoes had stopped. The only sound was my boots crunching through volcanic grit and the distant hiss of steam vents. When I reached the camp, my training kicked in automatically. I pulled out my radio and started documenting everything I saw. Base, this is Blackwater. I'm at Hammond's campsite. Tent is severely damaged. Large tears in the fabric, consistent with bear claws. No sign of the researcher. But even as I spoke those words into the radio, something felt wrong. The tears in the tent were massive, bigger than any bear claws I'd ever seen, and there were no tracks, not one single paw print in the ash around the campsite. In this volcanic soil, everything leaves a mark. Bear big enough to shred a tent like that should have left tracks you could follow for miles. I circled the camp 3 times, looking for any sign of where Hammond might have gone. Her research equipment was scattered but not destroyed. Her notebook lay open to a page with frantic handwriting. It's watching me. Large shadow by the fumaroles. Moves wrong. No sound when it walks. The entry was dated yesterday. I felt the hair on my neck stand up, and for the first time in my career, I wished I wasn't alone in this remote valley. The sulfur smell seemed stronger now, and the ground tremors that usually came every few minutes felt different, more rhythmic, almost like breathing. I spent the next hour doing everything by the book, photographed the campsite, collected Hammond's scattered equipment, checked her planned research sites on the map. Standard missing person protocol says you start with the most logical explanations and work outward. Bears were active in the area. That was normal for August. The salmon runs bring them down from the high country. But Hammond knew bear safety. She had a spotless record of backcountry research. Her bear spray canister was still clipped to her pack, unused. I was cataloging her research notes when I heard it, a sound that made every muscle in my body freeze. It was a bear vocalization, deep and rumbling, but it was coming from my radio. The frequency was clear, no other voices, just that low, endless growl echoing from the speaker. "Bass, are you getting this?" I whispered into the microphone. Static. Then my own voice came back. "Bass, are you getting this?" The radio was picking up my transmission from 30 seconds ago. That was impossible. Radio waves don't just loop back on themselves. I switched off the radio and continued searching. Hammond's GPS unit was still recording data. The last few waypoints showed her path toward the main crater rim, following her planned research route. But the final waypoint was listed as coordinates that put her location 300 feet underground, inside solid rock. I've worked with GPS equipment for years. They malfunction sometimes, sure, but they don't just randomly place you inside mountains. The afternoon sun was starting to angle lower when I found the first real clue. Near a cluster of active steam vents, I discovered what looked like Hammond's boot print, just one, clear as day in the ash, pointing toward the old crater rim. But 3 feet later, the trail just stopped. No more prints. No sign of where she might have gone. I knelt down to photograph the print, and that's when I saw the other tracks alongside it. Bear tracks, but wrong somehow. Too big, for one thing. The biggest grizzly paw I'd ever seen would barely cover half of these prints. And they seemed to fade in and out of the ash, like they were being erased as I watched. I blinked hard and looked again. The tracks were still there, but fainter, like someone was slowly rubbing them out with an invisible eraser. Standing up fast, I almost lost my balance. The ground tremor that hit right then was stronger than any I'd felt before. But it wasn't random like volcanic tremors usually are. It had a rhythm. Step, pause, step, pause, like something massive was walking nearby. I looked around frantically but saw nothing, just the endless ash fields and the steam rising from dozens of fumaroles. But the tremors kept coming, and I realized they were getting stronger. Whatever was making them was getting closer. That's when I saw the shadow. It fell across the ground about 50 feet to my left, the unmistakable silhouette of a bear rearing up on its hind legs, massive, at least 12 feet tall. But when I spun around to see what was casting it, there was nothing there, just empty air above a patch of level ground. The shadow moved, dropped to all fours, and started walking toward me. But there was still nothing casting it. No bear, no rock formation, nothing. just a bear-shaped patch of darkness sliding across the volcanic ash like it was alive. I'm ashamed to say I ran. 15 years of training, and I ran like a scared kid. The shadow followed me for about 100 yards, then just stopped. When I finally got the courage to look back, it was gone. I made it back to the landing strip as the sun was setting. Frank was waiting with the plane, engine already running. "Find her?" he called over the noise. "No," I shouted back, "but we need to get more people up here tomorrow. Something's not right." As we lifted off, I looked down at the valley one more time. The steam from the fumaroles was rising in the still evening air, and for just a moment, the pattern of white vapor looked like a massive bear standing on its hind legs, watching our plane disappear into the distance. Frank saw it too. I could tell because his knuckles went white on the controls, and he didn't say another word during the entire flight back to headquarters. The next morning, I returned with a full search team. Lisa Clearwater, our cultural liaison and the best tracker in the park, plus 2 volunteers from the Alaska State Troopers. We had proper search equipment, emergency radios, and enough firepower to handle any normal bear situation. Lisa is Yup'ik, born and raised in the region. Her grandmother had lived through the 1912 eruption as a child. When I described what I'd found at Hammond's campsite, something changed in Lisa's expression. "My grandmother told stories," she said quietly as we hiked toward the site. "About the bears that died in the eruption. She said they never had time to understand what was happening. One moment they were in their dens, safe for winter. The next moment, everything was fire and ash. She said their spirits got trapped between the living world and the dead world. I'd heard those stories before. Tourist guides loved telling them around campfires. But coming from Lisa, in this place, they didn't sound like folklore anymore." We reached Hammond's abandoned campsite by mid-morning. In daylight, with a full team, everything looked more normal. The tent damage was severe, but it could have been a bear. The missing tracks could be explained by wind patterns in the ash. But our instruments were telling a different story. The seismic equipment I'd brought was registering impacts. Heavy ones, spaced about 6 feet apart, consistent with a large animal walking. But we couldn't see anything making the impacts. Every few minutes, the needles would spike as something massive stepped nearby, but the area around us was completely empty. "This doesn't make sense," muttered Jim Rodriguez, one of the troopers. "These readings show something the size of a small truck moving around us." The electromagnetic scanner was acting up too. Random bursts of activity that formed patterns. Almost like the electromagnetic signature you'd get from a large animal. But the readings came from spots where nothing was visible. Lisa had found Hammond's trail leading toward the crater rim. The boot prints were clearer in daylight, and we could follow them for almost a quarter-mile. But other tracks paralleled Hammond's path, massive bear prints that appeared and disappeared randomly, like they were being made by something that wasn't quite solid. "She was being followed," Lisa said grimly. "Or herded. These tracks, they're pushing her toward the old sacred sites." "Sacred sites?" Jim asked. "The places where bears denned before the eruption. My grandmother said those spots are still active. The spirits don't like people disturbing them." The temperature dropped suddenly, not gradually the way it does when clouds cover the sun. It dropped 10 degrees in about 30 seconds. Our breath started misting, and frost began forming on the equipment. That's when we heard the growling. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a deep rumble that seemed to rise from the ground itself, the kind of sound a grizzly makes when it's warning you to back off, but louder, much louder. and it went on for almost a full minute without pausing for breath. When it stopped, the silence was complete. No wind, no bird sounds. Even the constant hiss from the steam vents had gone quiet. "We should leave," Lisa whispered. "Right now." But Rodriguez was already moving toward the sound, his hand on his sidearm. Could be Hammond. Could be she's trapped somewhere and trying to signal us. He made it about 20 feet before the ground erupted in front of him. I don't mean it exploded like a volcano. I mean something massive burst up from underneath, sending ash and rocks flying everywhere. For just a moment, we all saw it clearly. A grizzly bear the size of a small building, gray as smoke, with eyes like burning coals. Rodriguez emptied his clip into it. 6 shots, center mass, from less than 30 feet away. The bullets passed right through like it was made of fog. The bear looked at him for a long moment. Then it opened its mouth and roared. The sound was so loud it knocked Rodriguez off his feet. Windows would have shattered if there had been any windows for miles around. Then it was gone. Not running away. Just gone. Like smoke in the wind. We found Hammond 20 minutes later. She was alive but barely conscious, hidden in a natural cave about a quarter-mile from where the bear had appeared. She kept mumbling about the Guardian and "they won't let me leave." Her notebook was clutched in her hands, filled with increasingly frantic entries about being watched, being herded, being protected. The last entry, written in shaking handwriting, said, "It's not trying to hurt me. It's trying to save me. There are men with machines coming to destroy the sacred places. The shadow bear knows. It won't let them." As we carried Hammond back toward the landing strip, Lisa grabbed my arm. "She's right," she said. "I've been hearing rumors. Mining survey teams asking about permits for this area. They want to dig where the bears' dens used to be." That's when we heard the planes. Not Frank's bush plane. These were bigger, louder, commercial aircraft flying low over the valley. As they passed overhead, the ground began to shake. Not tremors this time. Something much more violent. Every fumarole in the valley erupted simultaneously. Steam and sulfur gas shot hundreds of feet into the air. The temperature spiked so fast that snow on distant peaks started melting in real time. And in the pattern of rising steam, we could see them clearly now. Dozens of shadow bears standing on their hind legs, looking up at the aircraft with those burning coal eyes. The planes banked sharply and flew away. But the bears didn't disappear this time. They turned to look at us, and I knew with absolute certainty that we were about to become part of something much bigger than a simple rescue mission. We made it back to the landing strip, but Frank's plane was gone. In its place was a note weighted down with rocks. Strange activity reported. Aircraft grounded until volcanic alert level drops. Emergency pickup in 72 hours if possible. We were trapped. Hammond was conscious now, but exhausted. She told us everything while we waited in the emergency shelter near the landing strip. She'd been studying gas emissions from the 1912 eruption site when she discovered evidence of recent drilling. Core samples, survey markers. Someone had been testing the area for mineral extraction. "They found something," she said weakly. "Rare earth deposits trapped under the ash layers, worth millions. But the drilling sites are right on top of the old bear dens, the places where hundreds of bears died in the eruption." That's when the shadow bears started appearing around her camp. At first, just glimpses, then longer sightings. Finally, direct contact. They weren't trying to hurt her. They were trying to show her something. "They led me to the evidence," Hammond continued. "Illegal surveying permits, forged environmental impact studies. Someone's planning to strip mine this entire valley." Lisa nodded grimly. The sacred sites. They're trying to destroy the last resting places of the eruption victims. As if summoned by our conversation, the shadow bears began materializing around our shelter. Not threatening this time, just present, watching, waiting. The largest one, the alpha I'd seen earlier, took shape directly in front of our shelter entrance. In full daylight, it was terrifying and beautiful at the same time. Translucent gray fur rippled like fog in a breeze. Those burning coal eyes held an intelligence that was definitely not animal. It looked directly at me and spoke, not with words. The voice came from inside my head, deep and rumbling like an avalanche. The destroyers return tomorrow. Help us, or this valley dies. Images flooded my mind. The 1912 eruption seen from a bear's perspective. The terror of being trapped underground as the world ended in fire above. The slow realization that death had come but consciousness remained. Decades of watching over the valley, protecting what was left of their home. And now, the threat of machines tearing apart their final resting places for profit. We cannot fight the machines, but you can stop them. The law protects these places if you speak the truth. The mining permits, I said out loud. They're illegal, if we can prove it. The shadow bear nodded. Hammond pulled out her camera. I documented everything, photos of the illegal survey markers, core samples from protected areas, GPS coordinates proving they're violating federal law. But even as she spoke, we could hear aircraft returning. More of them this time. Heavy helicopters carrying equipment. The alpha shadow bear's eyes flared brighter. The temperature around us dropped so fast that ice crystals formed on our clothing. Every fumarole in the valley began venting steam at maximum pressure. They come with machines. We will stop them. But the battle will wake the deep fire. You must leave. Now. The ground began to shake, not the rhythmic tremors of walking bears. This was deep geological activity, the kind that happens right before a volcanic eruption. The bears, Lisa whispered in awe. They're triggering the volcano. They're going to stop the mining operation the only way they can. Rodriguez grabbed our emergency radio and started calling for immediate evacuation. But the response was chaos. Every seismic station in Alaska was registering massive activity centered on our location. The helicopters were landing in the main valley, about 2 miles away. We could see men unloading drilling equipment, working fast to set up operations before the volcanic activity got worse. They had no idea what they were really dealing with. The alpha shadow bear turned to us one last time. Remember us. Tell the truth. Protect the sacred places. Then all the shadow bears began moving toward the landing site. Dozens of them, flowing across the landscape like a gray tide. As they moved, the volcanic activity intensified. Lava began seeping up through cracks in the ground. The air filled with ash and the smell of sulfur. We ran for higher ground and watched the confrontation from a ridge about a mile away. The shadow bears surrounded the mining operation. At first, the workers didn't see them. But as the temperature dropped and the electromagnetic interference increased, their equipment began failing. Drill bits shattered, engines seized, electronic instruments went haywire. Then the bears became visible. From our vantage point, we could see the workers panic as dozens of massive grisly spirits materialized around their operation. The smart ones ran immediately. A few tried to stand their ground, firing weapons that had no effect on ethereal targets. The alpha bear reared up to its full 15-foot height and roared. The sound triggered a minor eruption from the nearest volcanic vent. Lava fountains shot 100 feet into the air. and superheated gas clouds engulfed the mining site. The helicopters took off in emergency evacuation mode, leaving millions of dollars of equipment behind to be consumed by the volcanic activity. As the aircraft disappeared over the horizon, the shadow bears began to fade. The volcanic activity slowly decreased. The immediate threat was over. But the alpha bear appeared one more time, directly in front of me. The machines will return. The law must protect this place forever. You have the proof. Use it. Then it was gone, and we were alone with the slowly cooling volcanic vents and the abandoned mining equipment melting in pools of lava. The rescue helicopters found us 18 hours later. By then, the volcanic activity had returned to normal levels, but the evidence of what had happened was undeniable. Millions of dollars of mining equipment lay twisted and melted across the valley floor. Hammond's camera contained everything we needed: illegal survey permits, unauthorized drilling in protected areas, environmental violations that would result in massive federal charges. The official report listed unexpected volcanic activity as the cause of the mining operation's failure. No mention of shadow bears or supernatural intervention. But the evidence Hammond had gathered led to a federal investigation that resulted in permanent protection status for the entire 1912 eruption site. The mining company executives went to prison. The valley was designated as a sacred cultural site, protected in perpetuity under both federal law and international indigenous rights agreements. I stayed on as ranger for another 12 years. During that time, I learned to work with Lisa and the Yupik elders to develop new protocols for protecting sites with spiritual significance. We called them Cultural Sensitivity Guidelines, and they became a model for other national parks. I never saw the shadow bears again, but sometimes on quiet August evenings during salmon season, I'd hear that deep rumbling sound echoing from the direction of the old crater. A reminder that some guardians never rest. Hammond recovered completely and changed her research focus to indigenous land rights. She became one of the leading advocates for recognizing spiritual sites as equal to geological features in federal protection laws. She never talked publicly about what really happened in that valley, but sometimes I'd catch her looking toward the horizon with a thoughtful expression. Lisa eventually became the park's chief cultural liaison. She instituted annual ceremonies to honor the bears that died in the 1912 eruption. Every August, we gather at the edge of the sacred sites to leave traditional offerings and speak words of respect for the spirits that still protect this land. The ceremonies work. No mining company has attempted to survey the area since 1987. No accidents have occurred during the salmon runs. The ecosystem thrives under protection that goes deeper than any law could provide. On the 10th anniversary of the incident, I was standing at the ceremony site when Lisa pointed toward a ridge overlooking the valley. For just a moment, silhouetted against the evening sky, we could see the outline of a massive bear watching the proceedings. It nodded once, then faded into the twilight. Some people ask me if I really believe in what happened that August. They want a rational explanation, scientific proof, evidence that could convince a skeptic. But I've learned that some truths are bigger than proof. Some protections run deeper than law, and some guardians never stop watching over the places they love. The shadow bears of Katmai are still there, waiting, watching, protecting the sacred places where they died and chose to remain. And as long as people remember to respect those places, the bears will keep the peace. But if someone tries to destroy what they guard, well, the valley remembers how to wake the deep fire. The bears remember how to rise, and the earth remembers how to fight back. My name is Anthony Blackwater, and that's the truth of what happened in the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. Whether you believe it or not doesn't change the fact that some places demand respect, and some spirits never forgive those who refuse to give it. My name is Samuel Frostborn, and I've been a park ranger in Alaska for 20 years. People always ask me about my last name. Yeah, it's real. And yeah, my Inupiaq grandmother said it was meant to be. You were born for the cold, Samuel, she'd tell me. The winter speaks to you. I never believed in any of that old stuff. Wendigos, ice spirits, all those stories the elders told around fires. I figured they were just ways to explain starvation and madness when people got lost in the white. Science could explain everything I'd seen out here in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. That was before February 1999. I was stationed near Prudhoe Bay, way up on the coastal plain. It's a lonely job, but someone has to keep an eye on things between the oil companies and the wildlife. During polar night, when the sun doesn't rise for months, it gets down to 60 below zero. That kind of cold will kill you in minutes if you're not careful. The call came in on February 15th. Jack Morrison, an oil equipment specialist, had missed his daily check-in. His work camp was about 50 miles north of my station, a tiny speck of warmth in an ocean of ice and darkness. When people go quiet up here, it usually means they're dead. I loaded my snowcat with emergency gear and headed out. The aurora was dancing overhead, green and purple ribbons across the black sky. Beautiful, but it felt wrong somehow. Too bright, too active. The shapes looked almost like faces. I shook my head. 20 years in the Arctic, and I was starting to see things. Morrison's camp was a standard setup: insulated huts, generator, fuel tanks. But something was off the moment I arrived. The place was too quiet. No humming generator, no radio chatter. Just silence so complete it made my ears ring. I found Jack's main shelter first. The door was open, which made no sense in this cold. Snow had blown inside, covering everything in a thin white layer, but the heater was still burning, full flame, like someone had just fed it fresh fuel. That should have been impossible. In 60 below weather, an open door would freeze a hut solid in minutes. But this place was warm, hot even. Then I saw the bones. They were arranged in a circle around the heater. Human bones, picked clean and white. Arm bones, leg bones, ribs. But they weren't random. Someone had placed them carefully, like decorations. My radio crackled to life. Frostborn, this is base. What's your status? I stared at the bones, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. Base, I'm at Morrison's camp. I need immediate medical evacuation and crime scene investigators. Copy that. What's the situation? I looked around the warm hut, at the impossible heater still burning bright, at the bones arranged like some sick art project. I think we have a murder. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't right. No murderer would sit around long enough to pick bones this clean. Not in this cold. Not in this darkness. And there was something else. The bones weren't quite right. They were too big somehow, too long. I stepped outside to wait for backup, and that's when I heard it. A sound like wind, but not wind. Like singing, but not human. It came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing across the endless white. My grandmother's voice whispered in my memory. When the hungry ones wake, Samuel, they sing for their supper. I told myself it was just the wind. The helicopter couldn't make it out until the next morning. Storm coming in, pilot said. I spent the night in my snowcat, engine running, trying not to think about those bones. But I couldn't sleep. Every few hours, I'd hear that sound again, that not quite singing. And footsteps. Heavy ones, crunching through snow just outside my vehicle. When I'd shine my flashlight out the window, there was nothing. Just empty white stretching forever under the dancing aurora. Maria Kanguk arrived with the helicopter crew. She was our cultural liaison, an Inupiaq elder who helped us understand traditional land use. At 65, she was tougher than most people half her age. But when she stepped out of that helicopter, her face went pale. "This place feels wrong," she said immediately. "The spirits are angry here." "Maria, we need to focus on facts. Someone was killed in that shelter." She walked past me toward Morrison's hut, moving carefully through the snow. Halfway there, she stopped. "Samuel, look at these tracks." I joined her, looking down at the footprints she'd found. They were human, definitely. Bare human feet in the snow. But that was impossible. Bare skin would freeze solid in seconds at these temperatures. "Look at the stride," Maria said quietly. The footprints were spaced 8 feet apart. No human could take steps that long, not through deep snow. "Must be snowshoes," I said. The marks got distorted by wind. Maria knelt down, studying the prints more carefully. "Samuel, these are fresh, made in the last few hours." She looked up at me. "What human can walk barefoot through snow in 60 below cold?" I didn't have an answer for that. We went into the shelter together. Maria took one look at the bone circle and started backing toward the door. "We need to leave. Now." "Maria, this is a crime scene. We can't just..." "This isn't a crime scene, Samuel. It's a feeding ground." The helicopter pilot's voice crackled through our radios. "Hey guys, you need to see this. I'm flying a sweep pattern, and there's someone walking out here." We rushed outside. The pilot was hovering about a mile away, spotlight aimed down at the tundra. Human figure, walking north, no protective gear visible. I grabbed my binoculars and looked where he was pointing. There, moving across the white landscape, was a person. Tall, thin, walking with those same impossible 8-foot strides. "Set us down near him," I radioed. "I don't think that's a good idea," the pilot replied. "This guy's been walking for at least an hour in open air. He should be dead." But we went anyway. By the time we landed, the figure was gone. Just those same bare footprints leading north across the tundra, disappearing into the darkness. "Where could he have gone?" I asked. "There's nowhere to hide out here." Maria was quiet for a long moment, staring at the tracks. Finally, she said, "My grandmother told me stories about the hungry ones, the ones who ate their families when the food ran out. They don't die in the cold anymore, Samuel. The cold is part of them now. Those are just stories. Then explain this." She pointed at the footprints. "Explain how a human walks barefoot through snow that would kill anyone else. Explain how he moves 8 feet at a time. Explain why he doesn't leave any other trace. No breath vapor, no body heat melting the snow." I couldn't explain it, but I wasn't ready to believe in monsters. We set up a temporary camp near the helicopter. As night fell, though it was hard to tell, since we'd been in polar darkness for weeks, that sound started again. The not wind, not singing. This time it was closer. "It's calling to us," Maria whispered. Through the walls of our heated shelter we could hear footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling our camp. The pilot tried to radio for backup, but something was interfering with our communications. Static filled with what sounded like whispered words. Words in Inupiaq. Old words. Hungry words. I grabbed my rifle and stepped outside. "Hello? Jack Morrison? Are you out there?" The footsteps stopped. In the silence, I could hear my own heartbeat, my own breathing. Nothing else. Then, from the darkness beyond our lights, a voice answered. "So, cold. Samuel, So, hungry. It was Jack's voice, but wrong somehow, stretched thin, like it was coming from very far away. Jack, come into the light. We're here to help you. A shape moved at the edge of our vision. Tall, impossibly thin, just barely visible in the aurora's glow. For a second, I thought I saw Jack Morrison's face. Then it smiled. The teeth were too long, too sharp, and there were too many of them. The thing that had been Jack Morrison took a step toward us, and I finally understood why the footprints were 8 feet apart. It wasn't taking human steps anymore. The thing in the darkness didn't come closer that first night. It just watched us from beyond the light, occasionally calling out in Jack's voice, saying he was cold, saying he was hungry, asking us to come help him. Maria and I took turns on watch. Every time I looked out, those yellow eyes were there, reflecting our lights like an animal's, but too high off the ground, way too high. It's testing us, Maria said during her watch, seeing how we react, learning. Learning what? How to hunt us. When dawn came, or what passed for dawn during polar night, we found more bones around our camp, fresh ones. The pilot checked our supplies and went white. Our emergency rations are gone, 3 days' worth of food. That's impossible. The containers were sealed, but they were empty. Every can, every package. And outside we found more footprints. These ones led right up to our shelter walls. The thing had been inches away from us while we slept. The pilot tried to start the helicopter. Nothing. Engine's been tampered with, fuel lines cut. We were stranded. That's when the radio crackled back to life. Dr. Linda Chen's voice filled with static and panic. Anyone out there? Our team is in trouble. We found something. Someone. He says he knows Samuel Frostborn. Chen's research camp was 20 miles south. Her team was studying climate change effects on permafrost. 3 scientists, isolated just like us. Chen, this is Frostborn. Stay inside. Do not approach any strangers. Too late. He's here now, standing right outside our shelter. He says he's Jack Morrison. He says you sent him to get us. I grabbed the radio. Chen, that is not Jack Morrison. Whatever you do, don't let him inside. Silence, then screaming. The radio went dead. We have to help them, I said. We can't. Maria was packing her traditional gear, things I'd always thought were just cultural artifacts. We need protection first. She built a fire outside our shelter using driftwood and seal oil she'd brought. The flames burned blue-white, crackling with something that smelled like home and safety and warmth. As soon as it lit, the feeling of being watched faded. Fire keeps them back, she explained, but only sacred fire, and only for a while. Them? How many are there? Just one, but it's growing stronger. Every person it takes, every meal it has, makes it more powerful. We kept the fire burning and hiked toward Chen's camp. The landscape looked different somehow. Wrong. The snow was arranged in patterns that hurt to look at, spirals and angles that shouldn't exist in nature, and everywhere, those 8-foot footprints, leading in all directions, like the thing had been running in circles around the entire area. Chen's camp was destroyed, not damaged, destroyed. The shelters had been torn apart from the inside, metal walls peeled back like flower petals. Equipment scattered across the snow in careful arrangements. We found Chen's team. What was left of them? They were arranged in the same bone circle pattern as Jack's remains. But these were fresh, still warm, and one of them was moving. Dr. Chen was still alive, barely. Frostbitten, delirious, missing her left arm below the elbow. When she saw me, she tried to speak. It wore Jack's face, she whispered. But when it smiled, when it opened its mouth, There was nothing but hunger inside, nothing but winter. She died before we could get her back to our fire. That night, the thing came back, but it was different now, stronger, taller. When it spoke, it used Chen's voice mixed with Jack's voice, words overlapping and echoing. "Samuel, so cold out here. Come warm me up. I know you want to help." Maria was chanting in Inupiaq, feeding our sacred fire with special oils and carved bone. The flames grew higher, brighter, but I could see the effort was draining her. "How long can we keep this up?" I asked. "Not long enough. It's feeding, growing. Soon our fire won't be strong enough to hold it back." As if it heard her, the thing laughed. Multiple voices now. Jack, Chen, others I didn't recognize. How many people had it taken over the years? "There are others," Maria said quietly. "Other camps, other research stations. It's been hunting them for months. We just never connected the disappearances." The yellow eyes moved closer to our fire's edge. Just outside the light, I could see its shape more clearly now. 12 feet tall, impossibly thin, moving wrong, like its joints bent in directions they shouldn't. And its mouth, God, its mouth, wide as a bear trap, filled with teeth like broken ice. "Tomorrow," it said in a dozen stolen voices. "When your fire burns low, we feast." Maria worked through the night, preparing for what she called the old binding. She arranged carved bones and stones in complex patterns around our fire, chanting words in traditional Inupiaq that she said were older than the villages, older than the missionaries, older than anyone alive. "My great-grandmother taught me this when I was very young," she explained. "She said someday the hungry ones would wake again, when the ice melts and the old places are disturbed, when people forget the proper respect for the winter." "You're talking about climate change?" "I'm talking about balance. The ice holds things down, Samuel. Old things, hungry things. When it melts..." She gestured toward the aurora, which was writhing overhead like something alive. "They wake up." As dawn approached, our sacred fire began to burn lower. No matter how much fuel Maria added, the flames wouldn't grow. The thing in the darkness pressed closer, its yellow eyes now visible just beyond our circle of light. "Soon," it whispered in Jack's voice, "so hungry, so long since the last feast." That's when I heard the helicopter. The sound came from the south, a rescue team, finally responding to our emergency calls. But I knew it was too late. They'd land right in the creature's hunting ground. "We have to warn them," I said. Maria grabbed my arm. "If we leave the fire's protection, it will take us. Then it will take them too." The helicopter set down about 100 yards away. 2 figures climbed out, moving toward our firelight. I could see their headlamps bobbing in the darkness. "Hey!" I shouted. "Stay back! Don't come any closer!" But they kept walking, and as they got nearer, I realized they were moving wrong. Same 8-foot stride, same impossible height. "It's mimicking the rescue team," Maria said, "making us think help has arrived." The fake rescuers reached the edge of our firelight. In the flickering glow, I could see their faces were wrong. Features that almost looked human but stretched and distorted, like someone had tried to remember what people looked like but got the details wrong. "Samuel Frostborn," one of them said in a voice like wind through ice. "We're here to help. Come with us to safety." "No," Maria said firmly. "The real binding starts now." She threw a handful of carved bones into the fire. The flames roared higher, burning bright blue. The fake rescuers screamed and stumbled backward. But that's when the real Wendigo appeared. It rose up behind the false men like a mountain of pale flesh and hunger. 12 feet tall, emaciated beyond anything that should still be alive. Its skin was gray-white, covered in frost. Its eyes burned yellow in the firelight. And its mouth opened wide enough to swallow a person whole. Finally, it said in the voices of everyone it had ever eaten, "No more games." It stepped toward our fire. The sacred flames flickered but held. Maria began the binding chant, her voice rising in the old language. The Wendigo stopped, writhing like the fire was causing it physical pain. But it didn't retreat. "Your magic is weak, old woman," it hissed. "I have eaten for months. I am strong." That's when I understood. The missing research teams, the oil workers who disappeared over the winter. It had been feeding, growing stronger with each kill. Our little sacred fire wasn't enough anymore. "We need more fuel," Maria gasped. "Something to feed the binding flame." I looked around desperately. We were in the middle of empty tundra. No trees, no wood, nothing but snow and ice and Jack Morrison. He was standing at the edge of the firelight, just outside the Wendigo's shadow. The real Jack, or what was left of him. Pale and frostbitten, but somehow still human. "I can break the binding," he said quietly, "but it means I have to go into the fire, willingly, to pay for what I became." The Wendigo spun around, seeing its first victim for the first time since the transformation. "You cannot. You are mine. You fed me, gave me strength." Jack stepped closer to our fire. With each step, he became more solid, more real. I was starving, lost in a blizzard, when I found those old bones from the 1920s expedition. I was so hungry. He looked at me with eyes full of terrible understanding. I ate from the bones, and it woke up inside me, the hunger that never ends. The Wendigo lunged forward, trying to grab Jack, but it couldn't cross into our sacred fire's protection. All it could do was rage and howl. "If I choose to burn," Jack said, "if I give myself willingly to the sacred fire, it breaks the connection. The Wendigo starves." Maria nodded, tears on her face. The old stories. A willing sacrifice can break any binding. Jack looked at me one last time. "Tell my family. Tell them I tried to come home." He stepped into the sacred fire. The flames roared higher than any fire should burn, reaching toward the aurora like a pillar of light. Jack's form dissolved into pure energy, feeding the ancient binding magic. The Wendigo screamed, a sound like winter itself dying. Its massive form began to collapse, the stolen flesh melting away like snow in spring. All the voices it had taken cried out at once, then faded to silence. When the fire finally burned down to normal size, there was nothing left but empty snow and the dancing aurora overhead. And in the distance, the real rescue helicopter, coming to take us home. The official report said that Jack Morrison died of exposure and hypothermia after his equipment failed during an extreme weather event. Dr. Chen's team was listed as victims of the same storm. The oil company quietly shut down operations in that sector and declared it a wildlife protection zone. No one asked too many questions. In Alaska, people die in the winter. It's just how things are. But I know the truth. And more importantly, I know it's not over. Maria and I work together now, combining traditional knowledge with Park Service protocols. We're mapping the old sites, the places where the ice is melting and revealing things that should stay buried. Climate change isn't just about rising sea levels and dying polar bears. It's about waking up things that went to sleep when the ice was thick and the winters were long. We've found 6 more sites in the last 2 years, places where research teams or oil workers disappeared, where the aurora dances in skull-like patterns, where the snow arranges itself in spirals and the temperature drops suddenly with no meteorological explanation. Each site has bones, old bones, arranged in circles, and tracks that are just a little too big, with strides that are just a little too long. The elders say the hungry ones are stirring all across the Arctic. As the permafrost melts, as the old barriers weaken, they're remembering what it feels like to hunt. I keep Maria's sacred fire supplies with me now, wherever I go, and I listen to the old stories with new respect, because I've learned that some traditions aren't just folklore. They're survival guides for threats we'd forgotten existed. Last week, we got a call about a missing research station near Deadhorse. The team had been studying ice core samples, drilling deep into the permafrost. They'd found something preserved in the ice, bones, arranged in a pattern, frozen for centuries. Then they went quiet. Maria and I are heading out there tomorrow. We'll bring the sacred fire and the old protections, and hope it's enough. Because the hunger never really dies. It just waits. And now that the ice is melting, it's waking up hungry. The aurora danced outside my window as I finished writing this report. For just a moment, the green lights looked like teeth, like something massive and hungry, smiling down at our small, warm world. I told myself it was just the lights, but I made sure the fire was burning bright before I went to sleep. My name is Michael Ravenwood, and I've been a forest ranger in Alaska for 18 years. I'm telling you this story because someone needs to know what really happened out there in October 1962, even if the official reports say something different. I was stationed on Prince of Wales Island, way out in the southeastern part of the Tongass National Forest. It's the kind of place where you can go weeks without seeing another human being. The nearest town was a 2-hour seaplane ride away, and that was only when the weather was good. In October, the weather was almost never good. People always ask me why I chose such a lonely job. The truth is, I liked the quiet. My father had been a ranger too, and he died when I was 12. Being out there in the forest made me feel close to him somehow. Plus, I was half Tlingit on my mother's side, and the old stories said this land was sacred. I spoke the language and knew the customs, which helped when I had to work with the native communities. But I never believed the old stories about spirits and shapeshifters. Those were just tales to teach kids to be careful around the water, I thought. The Kushtaka, the otter spirits that could look like people, they were just make-believe. I was wrong about that. It was October 15th when I first heard about Dr. Helen Morrison. She was a marine biologist from the University of Washington, studying sea otter populations in our area. Smart woman, about 35, with 20 years of diving experience. She knew the water better than most fishermen. The call came in on my radio at 6 a.m. It was Jim Torres from the Coast Guard station in Ketchikan. Ravenwood, we've got a missing person report. Dr. Morrison was supposed to check in yesterday at 1800 hours. Her research partner in Seattle hasn't heard from her. I grabbed my gear and took the ranger boat out to her last known location, a sheltered cove near an old Tlingit village site. The place had been abandoned since the 1800s after a smallpox epidemic killed most of the people. Now it was just crumbling totem poles and stone foundations covered in moss. Morrison's camp was still there, a small research station she'd set up on the beach. Her tent was neat and organized, sleeping bag laid out, coffee still in the pot. But something felt wrong the moment I stepped onto that beach. Her research notes were scattered on the folding table, weighted down with rocks. The last entry was dated the day before, but it ended in the middle of a sentence. The otters are watching me write this. That was it. Just a dash at the end, like she'd stopped writing suddenly. I looked around the camp more carefully. Her diving gear was missing, but her backup equipment was still there. Her boat was pulled up on the beach, exactly where it should be. Everything looked normal, except for one thing. There were wet footprints leading from the water to her tent, but the tide had been out for 6 hours, and these prints were fresh. They were small, about her size, but something about them bothered me. They didn't look quite right, too narrow, and the toes seemed too long. I followed the prints, but they just stopped halfway to the tent, like whoever made them had just vanished into thin air. That's when I noticed the otters. There had to be 50 of them floating in the water just offshore, all facing the beach, all facing me. I'd been working these waters for years, and I'd never seen them behave like that. Otters are curious, sure, but they don't usually gather in groups that big, and they definitely don't stare at people like they're studying them. I tried my radio to report what I'd found, but all I got was static. Then, just for a second, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It sounded like my father's voice, very faint, calling my name, but my father had been dead for 32 years. I shook my head and tried the radio again. This time it worked fine. I reported Morrison as missing and requested a Coast Guard search team. They said they'd send a helicopter when the weather cleared, but a storm was moving in. It might be days before they could get out here. As I was packing up Morrison's camp to take it back to the station, I heard something that made me freeze. It was definitely my father's voice this time, calling from across the water. "Michael, son, help me." I looked up and saw a figure standing on the rocky point across the inlet. Even at that distance, I could tell it was him. Same height, same way of standing with one shoulder slightly higher than the other. He was waving at me, and I could see he was in some kind of trouble. But it couldn't be him. It couldn't be. I grabbed my binoculars and looked again. The figure was still there, still waving, still looking exactly like my dead father. That's when I knew something very wrong was happening on Prince of Wales Island. I radioed for backup, and Joe Brightwater said he'd fly out as soon as the weather allowed. Joe was a full-blood Tlingit, and the only other ranger who knew this area as well as I did. More importantly, he was one of the few people who still took the old stories seriously. While I waited for Joe, I decided to investigate the area where I'd seen the figure. I took my boat around the inlet to the rocky point, but when I got there, nobody was around. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been there at all. But something was definitely off about this place. The water was wrong, too warm for October, and it had a strange greenish tint. Fish were floating dead near the shore, not rotting like they'd been there a while, but fresh, like they'd just died suddenly. I was taking water samples when I heard Morrison's voice. "Michael, is that you? Thank God. I've been trapped down here for hours." The voice was coming from below me, from what looked like an underwater cave. I could see the entrance about 20 feet down, and there was definitely someone moving around inside. "Dr. Morrison, are you hurt? How did you get down there?" "My diving equipment malfunctioned. I'm almost out of air. Please help me." I was already reaching for my diving gear when something made me stop. Morrison had been missing for more than 24 hours. If she'd been trapped underwater that whole time, she'd be dead. No diving equipment could give you air for that long. "Dr. Morrison, I'm going to throw you a rope. Can you swim up to get it?" There was a long pause before the voice answered, and when it did, something about it sounded different, flatter. "I can't swim up. You have to come down here. Hurry, please." I looked down at the cave entrance again. In the dim underwater light, I could see a figure waving at me. It looked like Morrison, same short brown hair, same build. But the way she moved was wrong. Too smooth, like she was floating instead of swimming. That's when I saw the otters. They were everywhere, hundreds of them, surrounding my boat. They weren't making any noise, just floating there, watching me with those dark, intelligent eyes. Some of them were diving down toward the cave, then coming back up, like they were taking turns checking on something. "Michael, please," Morrison's voice called from below. "I'm scared." I wanted to help her, I really did, but every instinct I had was screaming that this was wrong. I started my boat engine and got out of there fast. Back at the ranger station, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. I called the University of Washington and asked about Morrison's diving experience. They confirmed she was an expert, certified for deep technical dives, with her own rebreather equipment, good for up to 6 hours underwater. But even with that gear, she couldn't survive a full day trapped in a cave. That evening, Joe Brightwater arrived in his float plane just as the storm was getting worse. Joe was about 50, with gray streaks in his long black hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. He'd been born and raised in a traditional Tlingit village, and his grandmother had been a shaman. "Bad weather coming," he said as we secured his plane. "We'll be stuck here for days." I told him about Morrison and about the voices I'd been hearing. I expected him to tell me I was imagining things, but instead he just nodded grimly. "Kushtaka," he said. "They're active again." "Come on, Joe. You know I don't believe in that stuff." He looked at me seriously. "Your mother never told you the stories. She told them to me as bedtime stories. They're not real." Joe was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My grandmother saw one once. She was about 7 years old, fishing with her father near Metlakatla. A Kushtaka appeared as her dead brother, trying to lead her into deep water. Her father saved her, but barely. That's just a story, Joe." "Is it? Tell me exactly what you heard, today, every detail." So I did. I told him about my father's voice, about Morrison calling from the underwater cave, about the strange behavior of the otters. Joe listened without interrupting, his expression getting more serious with every detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "They're hunting you, Michael. Kushtaka target people who are carrying grief, especially about family members who died near water. They appear as the dead person to lure you to them. My father didn't die near water. He had a heart attack on a mountain trail. But you found his body next to Deer Creek, didn't you? And you've always blamed yourself for not getting there in time." I stared at him. I'd never told anyone about the guilt I carried over my father's death. How did Joe know about that? "The Kushtaka can sense that kind of pain," Joe explained. "It draws them like blood draws sharks, and once they start hunting someone, they don't stop until they get them or until someone drives them away." That night, the storm hit hard. Rain pounded the station roof, and the wind howled through the trees like something alive. I tried to sleep, but every time I started to drift off, I'd hear my father's voice calling from outside. "Michael, son, I need your help." Joe heard it too. He'd brought traditional protection, copper knife, cedar bark, and other things I didn't recognize. He burned the cedar bark near the windows and doors, filling the station with sharp, clean smoke. "Copper and cedar," he explained. The old people knew Kushtaka couldn't stand them. Around midnight, the voices got worse. Not just my father now, but Morrison too. And other voices I didn't recognize. People I'd never met, calling my name, begging for help. "Don't listen to them," Joe warned. "Don't look outside. That's how they get you." But it was hard to resist. The voices were so real, so desperate. When I heard my father calling again, I found myself walking toward the door before Joe grabbed my arm. "That's not your father, Michael. Your father is at rest. That thing outside is something else wearing his voice like a mask. Just before dawn, everything went quiet. The storm was still raging, but the voices had stopped. Joe and I looked out the window carefully, and that's when we saw them. Dozens of otters, sitting on their hind legs in the clearing around the station. They were perfectly still, just watching our building. Some of them were huge, bigger than any otter I'd ever seen. And in the gray morning light, I could swear some of them had almost human faces. "We need to find Dr. Morrison," Joe said. "Today, before the Kushtaka take her so deep we can never get her back." "You really think she's alive?" Joe nodded. "Kushtaka don't kill right away. They keep people alive underwater, in air pockets, while they slowly steal their memories and their identity. Eventually, the person forgets they were ever human. They become Kushtaka themselves." I looked out at the watching otters and made my decision. Real or not, I couldn't leave Morrison to whatever was happening to her. "All right," I said. "What do we do?" Joe had radioed his Uncle Thomas before the storm hit. Thomas Kayahat was an elder from the village of Kasan, one of the few people left who remembered all the old ways. If anyone knew how to fight a Kushtaka, it would be him. "He'll come when the storm breaks," Joe told me. "But we need to scout the area first, find exactly where they're keeping Dr. Morrison." We spent the morning checking our equipment. Joe had brought things I'd never seen before: a knife made of native copper, carved bone amulets, and small bags of what looked like dried herbs and roots. "Traditional protection," he explained. "My grandmother's recipes. Some knowledge you can't get from books, Michael. It has to be passed down." Around noon, the wind died down enough for us to take the boat out. The otters were still watching from the shore as we left, but they didn't follow us into the water. That was almost more unnerving than if they had followed. We went back to the spot where I'd heard Morrison's voice. In daylight, I could see the underwater cave more clearly. It was bigger than I'd thought, with multiple chambers leading back into the rock. But the water around it still had that strange greenish tint, and it was definitely too warm. "There," Joe said, pointing to the water. "You see how the current moves wrong? How it spirals instead of following the tide?" He was right. The water was moving in slow, hypnotic circles around the cave entrance, like a massive drain. Fish that swam into the spiral seemed to get caught, swimming in tighter and tighter circles until they disappeared into the cave. "Kushtaka can control water," Joe explained. "They create currents to trap their prey." We circled the area in the boat, and Joe showed me other signs I'd missed. Kelp that grew in perfect geometric patterns, rocks arranged in ways that looked almost like altars, and everywhere the bones of sea animals, seals, fish, even whales, bleached white and arranged in spirals. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "Probably centuries. This was a traditional fishing spot for my people until the epidemic. After that, nobody came here anymore. The Kushtaka would have had the place to themselves." That's when we heard the voice again. Morrison, calling from underwater, begging for help. But this time, Joe heard it too. "She's really down there," he said, "but she's not alone anymore." "What do you mean?" "Listen." I listened more carefully, and Joe was right. Morrison's voice was clearer now, but there were other voices mixed in with it. Dozens of them, speaking in English and Tlingit, all begging for help, all calling from the same underwater cave. "All the people it's taken over the years," Joe said quietly. "They're still alive, but they're not really themselves anymore. The Kushtaka feeds on their memories, their personalities, until there's nothing left but echoes. We were about to leave when the water around our boat started to churn. Something was rising from the deep, something big. The boat rocked violently as a massive shape passed underneath us. Then we saw it. A sea otter, but huge, at least 12 feet long. It surfaced about 50 yards away, and when it looked at us, I saw intelligence in its eyes that was definitely not animal. It studied us for a moment, then dove again. "That's not a normal otter," I said. "No," Joe agreed. "That's the kushtaka itself, the real one. It's been down there for a very long time." The water around our boat was getting rougher. More shapes were moving underneath us, and the strange current was trying to pull us toward the cave entrance. "We need to get out of here," Joe said, "before it decides to take us too." I started the engine, but it sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. The boat was drifting closer to the cave, caught in that spiraling current. That's when I heard my father's voice again, much closer this time. "Michael, son, just let the water take you. It doesn't hurt. I'm waiting for you down there." I looked over the side of the boat and saw him, my father, exactly as he'd looked the last time I saw him alive, standing on the bottom of the inlet in 30 feet of water. He was gesturing for me to jump in, to swim down to him. "It's not him," Joe said sharply. "Michael, look at me. It's not him." But it looked exactly like him. Every detail was perfect. The scar on his chin from a childhood accident, the way his left eyebrow was slightly higher than his right, even the old ranger uniform he'd been wearing the day he died. "I know it's confusing, son," my father said from underwater, "but I never really died. I've been waiting for you down here all these years. Come join me." I was reaching for the side of the boat, ready to jump, when Joe grabbed my arm. "Michael, your father had brown eyes. Look at its eyes." I looked, and Joe was right. The thing that looked like my father had black eyes, like an otter's eyes. As soon as I noticed that, other details started looking wrong too. Its skin was too pale, too smooth. And when it smiled, I could see rows of sharp teeth. The engine suddenly roared to life. Joe gunned it, and we shot away from the cave just as more shapes started rising from the water behind us. In the boat's wake, I could see at least a dozen figures, people I didn't recognize, all beckoning us to come back. We made it to shore, but barely. The boat's engine died again as soon as we reached the beach, and the hull had 3 long scratches in it that definitely hadn't been there before. "It's getting stronger," Joe said. "The more people it takes, the more power it has. We need Thomas, and we need him soon." That evening, as if he'd been called by our need, Thomas Kayahat arrived in a traditional carved canoe. He was an old man, maybe 75, with long white hair and skin like weathered leather, but his eyes were sharp and alert, and there was something about him that commanded respect. He listened while Joe and I told him everything that had happened. He asked detailed questions about the voices we'd heard, the behavior of the otters, and the condition of the water around the cave. When we finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke in Tlingit, and Joe translated. He says this kushtaka is very old, very powerful. It's been feeding for over a century, growing stronger with each person it takes. But he thinks we can still save Dr. Morrison if we act tonight. "Tonight? In the storm?" Thomas spoke again, and Joe nodded grimly. "He says the storm is when the kushtaka is most active, but also when it's most vulnerable. The ritual has to be performed at the dark of the moon during running water. Tonight's our only chance." Thomas opened his bag and pulled out items I'd only seen in museums. Carved bone daggers, copper ornaments, bags of herbs and roots. Most importantly, he had a carved copper knife that looked ancient, Kushtaka can only be killed with copper, Joe explained. But it has to be copper that's been blessed in the old way, and the person using it has to be strong enough to resist the creature's illusions. What about Morrison? And all the other people trapped down there? Thomas spoke at length in Tlingit, his voice getting more urgent. Joe's face went pale as he listened. He says if we don't act tonight, the Kushtaka will complete its transformation of Dr. Morrison. Once that happens, she becomes one of them permanently, and it gets her memories, her knowledge. It learns more about the outside world. What does that mean? It means it could start hunting in towns, cities, places where people wouldn't recognize the signs until it was too late. I looked out at the dark water, knowing that somewhere down there Morrison was trapped, probably terrified, slowly losing herself to something that should have been just a story. "All right," I said. "What do we do?" The plan was simple but dangerous. We'd wait for low tide, when the cave entrance would be most accessible, then approach in Thomas's traditional canoe. The old man had brought copper-tipped spears and other weapons made the traditional way. Most importantly, he had a ceremony that could bind the Kushtaka, but only if someone could get close enough to the creature's true form. The hardest part, Joe explained, will be resisting its illusions. It will appear as everyone you've ever lost, everyone you've ever loved. It will promise you anything to make you stop fighting. At 2 a.m., the tide was at its lowest point. The storm had calmed to a steady rain, and Thomas said the conditions were right. We loaded the canoe with our gear and pushed off into the dark water. Thomas sat in the front, chanting softly in Tlingit and burning cedar bark in a small copper bowl. The smoke drifted around us like protection. Joe paddled in the middle and I took the rear position with one of the copper-tipped spears. As we approached the cave area, the wrongness hit me like a physical force. The water was definitely warm now, almost hot, and it glowed faintly green in the darkness. Hundreds of otters surrounded us, but they kept their distance from the smoke. "There," Joe whispered, pointing to the cave entrance. "I can see light inside." He was right. Deep underwater, there was a soft, pulsing glow coming from the cave. And floating near the entrance, perfectly still, was Dr. Morrison. She looked exactly as she had in her university photo. Short brown hair, serious expression, wearing her diving gear. But something was wrong with the way she floated. No bubbles came from her breathing apparatus, and her eyes were completely black. "Dr. Morrison," I called softly. Her head turned toward us with a mechanical jerk. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the water, despite being underwater. "Michael, you came back for me. I knew you would. Are you all right? Can you swim up to us? I can't leave yet. The others won't let me." She gestured deeper into the cave. "But you can come down here. It's safe. There's air to breathe." Thomas spoke sharply in Tlingit, and Joe translated. "He says don't trust anything it shows us. The real Morrison is deeper inside." As if it had heard him, the figure that looked like Morrison smiled. The expression was wrong, too wide, showing too many teeth. "Thomas Keahut," it said, pronouncing his name perfectly, despite being underwater. "The old shaman's grandson. Your grandmother couldn't save her brother, you know. He's down here with us. Would you like to see him?" A new figure appeared next to Morrison, an old Tlingit man in traditional clothing. Thomas made a sharp sound of grief, and I knew the Kushtaka had struck home. "Uncle," the figure called, "why didn't you come for me? I waited so long." "It's not real," Joe said firmly, but I could see Thomas wavering. More figures started appearing around the cave entrance. Men and women in clothing from different time periods, 1800s trappers, 1920s fishermen, more recent campers and boaters, all perfectly preserved, all calling to us. And then I saw him again, my father, standing among them, looking exactly as he had the last time I'd seen him alive. Michael, you're so close now. Don't you want to see me again? Don't you want to say the things you never got to say? I found myself reaching toward the water before Joe grabbed my wrist. That's not your father, Michael. Remember the eyes. Look at the eyes. I looked, and they were black, otter eyes. But the voice was perfect, every inflection exactly right. I know. You blame yourself for not finding me in time, my father said. But it wasn't your fault, son. Come down here, and I'll tell you about the last few minutes. I'll tell you I forgave you. The words hit me like a physical blow. That was the one thing I'd wanted to hear for 32 years. That my father didn't blame me for taking so long to find his body, for not being there when he died alone on that mountain trail. I was sliding toward the edge of the canoe when Thomas started chanting louder. The copper bowl flared with bright flame, and suddenly I could see clearly again. The figure that looked like my father was wrong in dozens of small ways. The proportions were off, the movements too fluid, and underlying the familiar features, I could see something else, something with sleek fur and predator's teeth. Now, Thomas shouted in English, while the illusions are weak. Joe and I paddled hard toward the cave entrance. The Kushtaka Morrison tried to grab the canoe as we passed, but the copper spear points made it recoil. We dove into the underwater cave just as the real Kushtaka rose from the depths. I'd thought the smaller creature we'd seen before was huge, but this thing was massive, at least 20 feet long, with the basic shape of a sea otter, but the torso and arms of a giant human. Its fur was black and silver, and its eyes reflected the faces of everyone it had ever taken. The cave had air pockets, just as the false Morrison had said. We surfaced in a large chamber filled with phosphorescent light from some kind of algae. And there, sitting on a ledge above the water, was the real Dr. Morrison. She was alive, but barely conscious. Her diving gear was gone, and she was wearing what looked like traditional Tlingit clothing made of kelp and seal skin. When she saw us, her eyes focused with difficulty. Who are you?" she asked. "Have I been home? I think I've been home, but I can't remember. Dr. Morrison, I'm Ranger Ravenwood. We're here to get you out. But I can't leave. My family is here. My parents, my sister. They're all waiting for me in the deep chambers." Joe checked her pupils with a flashlight. "She's been drugged somehow. The Kushtaka uses some kind of venom to make people compliant." The water in the chamber started churning as the massive Kushtaka entered below us. Thomas continued his chanting, and the creature seemed to have trouble approaching our position. "The ceremony," Joe said urgently. "Thomas needs to complete the binding, but someone has to keep the Kushtaka busy." I grabbed the copper spear and slipped back into the water. The Kushtaka was circling below us, sometimes looking like the giant otter creature, sometimes shifting to look like different people. I saw my father again, saw Morrison, saw faces I didn't recognize, probably people it had taken over the decades. "You can't kill me, boy," it said in my father's voice. "I've been here since your people first came to these waters. I've fed on their grief, their loneliness, their love for the dead. You can't destroy something that's part of nature itself." "Maybe not," I said, raising the spear, "but I can try." The Kushtaka lunged at me, and I drove the copper point deep into what I hoped was its heart. The creature screamed, not with its stolen human voices, but with the sound of rushing water and breaking ice. Light flared around us as Thomas completed his ceremony. The Kushtaka's form became unstable, shifting rapidly between its true shape and the dozens of people it had mimicked over the years. "The binding is working," Joe called, "but you have to keep it here until it's finished." The creature thrashed in the water, its massive form creating waves that slammed against the cave walls. I held onto the spear, letting the Kushtaka's own movements drive the copper deeper. "All those people," I gasped. "What happens to them?" The Kushtaka's eyes cleared for a moment, and I saw something almost like regret in its expression. They were already dead when I found them. I only borrowed their shapes, gave them one last chance to speak. The light grew brighter, and the creature's form began to dissolve. As it faded, I heard dozens of voices whispering thank you in English and Tlingit. The stolen faces flickered one last time in its eyes, my father among them, before the Kushtaka crumbled into sea foam and drifted away. The cave shuddered and began to collapse. Joe and I grabbed Morrison and swam for the entrance, following Thomas's light. Behind us, the ancient cavern system that had been the Kushtaka's home for over a century fell in on itself. We surfaced in open water just as the last of the cave system collapsed. The sea around us returned to its normal temperature and color. The watching otters had disappeared, and for the first time in days, the water felt clean. We got Dr. Morrison to the medical station in Ketchikan, where the doctors said she was suffering from severe hypothermia and mild delusional episodes, probably from drinking seawater and eating kelp while she was lost. That's what went into the official report anyway. Morrison herself remembered very little. She thought she'd fallen into a tidal pool and hit her head, then wandered around lost for a few days before we found her. She had no memory of underwater caves or ancient spirits. The doctors said that was normal for someone who'd been through such trauma. I filed my report 3 days later. According to the official record, Dr. Morrison had an equipment malfunction while diving, became disoriented, and took shelter in a sea cave during the storm. We located her using standard search and rescue procedures after receiving reports of someone calling for help near the abandoned village site. The only unusual details I included were warnings about dangerous tidal conditions and unpredictable fog banks in that area. I recommended that the whole section be marked as hazardous to small boats and inexperienced divers. Joe returned to his regular patrol area, but not before giving me some parting advice. "There are more of them out there, Michael. Not many, but some. They usually stay in deep water, far from people. But sometimes they get hungry or curious or just bored. When they do, people disappear. How do we stop them? You can't stop them all. But you can be ready, learn the signs, keep the traditional protections, and never trust a familiar voice calling from the water." Thomas Kahat stayed for one more day to perform a cleansing ceremony for the area. He said the land itself had been scarred by decades of the Kushtaka's presence, and it would take time for the natural balance to return. Before he left, he gave me a copper amulet, a small otter carved in traditional style. "Not all otters are Kushtaka," he said through Joe's translation. "Most are just animals, doing what animals do. But this will help you tell the difference, if you ever need to." I kept the amulet, and I wear it still. I also started studying Tlingit traditions more seriously, learning the stories my mother had tried to teach me when I was young. I realized that what I'd always dismissed as superstition was actually practical survival knowledge, passed down through generations of people who'd learned to live with things that couldn't be explained by science. 6 months later, I got a letter from Dr. Morrison. She'd been offered a research position at a marine station in California and was leaving Alaska for good. She said she'd been having strange dreams about the ocean, and she thought a change of scenery would help. "I keep dreaming I'm underwater," she wrote, "but instead of being scared, I feel like I'm home, like I belong there. It's probably just my mind processing the trauma, but the dreams feel so real. Sometimes I wake up with kelp in my hair, even though I live 5 miles from the ocean now." I never wrote back. There was nothing I could say that would help her, and nothing she would believe if I told her the truth. The Coast Guard reported 2 more missing persons in Alaskan waters that year, both experienced boaters who vanished in calm weather. Their boats were found drifting empty, with no signs of struggle. The official cause was listed as man overboard in both cases. But I knew better. I filed reports recommending increased patrols in areas with unusual otter populations, and I started working with other rangers to document traditional knowledge about water safety. We couldn't tell people the whole truth, but we could teach them to recognize the warning signs. I retired from the Forest Service in 1985, but I still live in Alaska. Sometimes, on foggy nights when the tide is changing, I hear voices calling from the water. Familiar voices, friendly voices, voices of people I miss. I don't answer them anymore. I know better now. If you're ever near the water in Alaska, especially in the remote areas where few people go, remember this story. If you hear a loved one calling to you from the water, if you see someone you recognize beckoning from dangerous places, if the otters are watching you with too much intelligence in their eyes, don't investigate. Get away from the water as fast as you can. And whatever you do, don't listen to the voices. No matter how real they sound, no matter how much you want to believe them, they're not who they appear to be. The Kushtaka are still out there, waiting in the deep water. And they remember every face they've ever seen, every voice they've ever stolen. They're very patient hunters, and they're always hungry.